Okay, this lesson addresses something called textualism. It's quite dynamic, it's amplified, and it's the center of the world's attention, if you will, because another Supreme Court nominee is being interviewed, vetted, being interrogated, being reviewed, evaluated, all the words we might want to use to take the vacancy that recently occurred on the Supreme Court through the death of Justice Ginsburg. Now, the banter has to do with all the way back to a justice called Scalia, who was considered to be a textualist. And that idea, what does that mean, is judges are constrained by what the law actually says rather than empowered to read into it. Now, for us who interpret, let's say, the Bible text, Bible means book, so we interpret documents, refer back to what we call originals, which are actually extant copies of original text, and we evaluate that. Well, we always fight eisegesis because we carry into a text what we already previously understand, and that's something we have to stop and pause and evaluate ourselves, because now that we're aware of eisegesis, that is also a way to guard against it. But that's, rather than read into it their personal dogma, which to an extent everyone does, our morality or immorality, that's relative. Political views, I don't mean political science necessarily, I'm referring to things like partisanship, and then or social causes. And you can see when you apply this in this direction, it's causing a lot of people to be very anxious, a lot of pushback is taking place. But what we may not be aware of is if you went this direction toward religion, you'd get the same pushback. Because until this nomination process began, I had no idea there was such a thing as Catholics for choice. Now, you say, you had to know. I didn't know. Catholic identity, according to me, was stereotypically established through the lens of those who crafted it in this area. Every time I've communicated with people who identify as Catholic or genuinely were Catholic from their upbringing or their cultural identity, they're pro-life, meaning they even oppose, they don't support death penalty. So to find out Catholics for choice, that was quite interesting. Then to learn by a Catholic apologist who was explaining that in 2019, Pew Research found that 66% of Catholics, those identifying as Catholics, when interviewed, deny their cardinal doctrine of transubstantiation, which is the dogma or the feature or the faith assertion that the wine and wafer that they distribute, their clergy, their priest, distribute to the laity, their word, which is from laos, people, that wafer and wine actually transform into actual flesh and blood, not just flesh and blood, but the flesh and blood of Christ himself. But now 66% of those interviewed deny it. Also in this Catholics for Choice, they disagree. This organization disagrees with dictates of the Vatican. Well, it's something I've always heard about in the West and in the United States especially. There's quite a gap between the dogma of the Vatican and the social values or practices of Catholic people here in the United States. But in the main, pro-life seems to be something that I had always assumed they all did that. But in light of this, it's true then that if you were to practice textualism, I mean, let's just take the New Testament. Let's forget arguments about apocryphal books and 83 books or 66. Let's just take 27 New Testament books that contain the teachings of Jesus and those of his followers. And let's just say among Catholic and Protestant groups or those traditions, we just all talk about that. Well, if in Catholic order or religious tradition you learned of those books, you learned the teachings, and in the Protestant traditions you learned of those books and those teachings of Jesus, and we found a way for textualism to be expected of, let's say, clergy in Catholicism or priest in Catholicism and clergy in Protestantism, because speaking of from the view of a Baptist who's neither Catholic nor Protestant, it's a little different because it is expected for us to teach, adhere, and prescribe and align ourselves with this and not to import into the text. And that includes our constructs that have originated even from Catholic or Protestant orders, such as some of the soteriology, as we've talked before numerous times about the construct Calvinism, which a lot of people don't even really know the historical tenets of it, as advocated by those who originally postulated it. It has a lot to do with theodicy, and a lot of people don't notice the difference. They only focus it on soteriology and avoid the greater context of theodicy. But that's another story. The issue here is, what is it about this textualism? And here's a book by John Meacham, Pulitzer Prize winning author. This one's Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. This is a 2012. It's a very good book, and it's a large, heavy book. And in it, it says, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislators should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Benjamin Rush had helped inform Jefferson's views on church and state in 1800, saying, I agree with you likewise in your wishes to keep religion and government independent of each other. Rush had told Jefferson, were it possible for St. Paul to rise from his grave at this present juncture, he would say to the clergy, who are now so active in settling the political affairs of the world, cease from your political labors, your kingdom is not of this world. Read my epistles. In no part of them will you perceive me aiming to depose a pagan emperor or to place a Christian upon a throne. Christianity disdains to receive support from human governments. Now, if you'll notice on this other side over here, Roe v. Wade, which appears to have occurred about the time this organization emerged, the wall of separation, I just read from that, which was found within the correspondence of the Danbury Baptist and Thomas Jefferson. Now, when I speak of Baptists, I'm not talking about whatever's out there, just anything out there. I'm speaking of those who preached the gospel and baptized those who believed it without a license and were here instrumentally being used to establish what we now know today as a United States that does not find itself under the purview of a church of the United States like Church of Rome, Church of England, Church of Geneva, no state-established church. There is no Catholic state, Judaic state, Islamic state, Protestant state, of anything like that operating in the United States. Now, that could be a naive expression of mine and I guess a belief that these things are still so, but as late as 2012, we still have the conversation about the reality of it. We also have the disestablishment of religion, where the Federalist Party had aligned itself with the Congregationalists, who went in an alliance to agree to support the candidates to assure they were elected by influencing their laity. And the Federalist Politician Party had agreed to legislate the very people that the clergy were to be caring for and teaching the Bible, if you will. Ironically, Jesus says, do unto others, you'd have them do unto them. So they were fleecing their people, allowing the ones who passed the laws to tax them, to pay the clergy, who would then influence the people to elect the ones who were passing the laws to tax them. So yeah, that's terrible on several fronts. It's reciprocal abuse, and it was occurring both sides against the middle, the politics on one side, religion on the other, and the people in the middle. And that was disestablished in the United States in no small part because of the group accused, categorized, baptizers. Freedom of conscience, thought, and speech, that's a Bill of Rights, inalienable rights, Bill of Rights. Then we have no church of the United States, nor a government that is not of the people, for the people, and by the people. So you can see why the idea of textualism doesn't bode well for products of activism, products that, let's say, occurred from the court rather than through legislative actions. We're a constitutional republic, and our representatives, once elected through the process of electoral process, nominees, candidates, elections, now we have electoral college, we have all the voting rights. So what we're looking at now is a strange disconnect, because here, this would not have been here through legislation. It was placed here through a court. Now, that's part of why a textualist, if you favored this, you wouldn't be for a textualist. But on the other hand, neither would this religious camp, who now has among a Catholic order, which is known for pro-life, which was once known until this research came to my attention, for believing and teaching transubstantiation. So a lot's changed over here, because activism has reshaped Catholicism into an expression of which I was completely unaware. And it has reshaped what we would notice here, because if this were a product of legislation and subject to it, then as you notice, the conflict today is when people hear about legislation being done in states about, let's say, the heartbeat law, when, let's say, the state of Arkansas says we do not legalize abortion, and from the time a heartbeat can be affirmed or confirmed, then no abortion can take place. Well, then the court will interfere. But see, this has never really been challenged from whether or not it's a product of a court or a product of legislation. For example, Indian Removal Act, 1830. Marshall was the Supreme Court justice name, and he had, I guess, adjudged that the Native Americans, the civilized tribe, of unusual description, had the right to remain in their land, specifically in Georgia and the southeast area of the United States. Houses, homes, plantations, their own newspapers, very literate, very educated, very civilized in every first world order manner of which people could be live, high order, high standard of living. But Andrew Jackson, President of the United States, said, well, Marshall has made his judgment, let him enforce it. Okay, so in that case, you saw, on the other hand, you saw politics rejecting a ruling by a court, and that was a decision that would have fallen under textualism, where the judge was not being an activist, but he was guarding the sovereign rights of those people who were here first. So no rational being would suggest by any manner, whether it be through law, whether it be the executive branch, the president, or it be through legislative branch, House and Senate, no rational person could conclude otherwise that those people had the sovereign right to remain exactly what they were from and had become. I've never heard anyone even suggest that Andrew Jackson was right in his presumption to ignore the court. So as he, as an executive in the executive branch, ignored alliance with even a treaty, for example, or the judgment of a court, or the Constitution, or all men are created equal, or the Bill of Rights, or inalienability of them, he would not extend that. So that was a difficult matter. Now, it doesn't matter what we say today, reversing that, reflecting on it in retrospect. The truth of the matter is that in this study of apologetics, which is language-based, we're actually, by saying language-based, we are as closely tethered to the text as you can be. And when we find out that the text doesn't always say exactly what we had already formulated in our own minds in our own faith, it's because we learned from, let's say, a Western Occidental perspective rather than from an Eastern Oriental. We learned from a macro perspective that might have had a philosophical, theological influence, both influences upon it. And we were taught from conclusions, not the process of getting there. For example, total hereditary depravity is a conclusion, and seldom do people start with the text and come to that conclusion. They have that conclusion and then go to the text to find supporting text for it, and that's called proof texting. So in this class, Apologetics and Outreach, that's language-based, we are as close to the text you get. And we have no interest to be served to ignore the text because we're free to study it. And for example, where I pastor, there is nothing like a New Covenant church that is the freedom to study the text, because it's actually the expectation. So yes, we have people come in with their canned, like this little Clorox cleaning, this little canned thing of wipes that I use to clean this dry erase, but they come in with their little commercialized Christianity, and some have come in and pretended that it's infallible, and they pretended that it was upsetting to them if you don't take the Bible and support what's infallible, like when the pre-trib was sensationalized through Tim LaHaye, Left Behind. My granddaughter and I watched the more contemporary version that has a famous actor, Nicolas Cage, in it, and she was fascinated by it. And I love watching it with her and explaining to her. It gave the nature of the world and how men mistreat each other, which we already have that all through history. But it was really interesting, but it never occurred to me, nor would it occur to her, that I should somehow take the Bible and wrap it around that Hollywood presentation, nor around that fiction novel writers that wrote, co-authored with Tim LaHaye. I've never noticed someone, it would be as irrational as someone thinking Charlton Heston, who played Moses in the Ten Commandments, was really Moses. So I don't know what that is, but where I'm at a New Covenant church or covenant community, there's no expectation for me to even in the slightest to take the text and make it match commercialized Christianity or the merchandising of men that people are doing out there. So there's no expectation, there's no reprisals. People who have a problem with the text are just like this religious camp and this political camp. If you have a problem with the wall of separation, which can't be scaled, where the government can't dictate to churches, then take it up in a legislative manner, in a process to amend the Constitution, through a constitutional republic, find representatives, elect them, have them go and champion your cause, petition, file the grievances, go and have the signatures secured, whatever. But the freedom of conscience, thought, and speech, as even persecution, for example, through Inquisition, the Fifth Amendment, even though it's exploited by people to try to avoid prosecution that's due them and justice that should be served to them and a rule of law that should be swiftly applied to them, it was actually intended to prevent anyone from self-incriminating, because if you gave the wrong answer to a religious inquisitor, which what's the right answer? Well, that's not up to us, is it? It was always up to the dogma. Now I'm just pointing here because that's the column of religion, because Baptists, that category of people who were neither Catholic nor Protestant, were persecuted by both sides. So we hold a great interest for the sake of all in our country, for the sake of anyone, regardless of how they identify themselves politically, socially, or religiously. So if you are a Democrat, millennial, Catholic, that's this kind, or you're a Republican boomer who's a pro-life Catholic, what would that have to do with inciting any retaliation from a Christian, a Baptist who's not here except to support pluralism? We give and extend to our neighbor the right and acknowledge the freedom of speech, conscience, and thought. Now, the fact that it's not always reciprocated is just true of everyone. These folks, I'm sure, get a lot of pushback, just like pro-life gets pushback. That's all part of the process. It's just that textualism is a problem for both camps. If this candidate, let's say Amy Coney Barrett, were to then begin to impose her knowledge of the text and take her subject matter expertise and her specialized knowledge of interpretation and use etymology and syntax and grammar and all those things and begin to try to press that this direction, she'd find as much people upset and outraged and an outcry just like she's finding over here. Because when you push toward activism, whether it's it's a political base of operations for activism, or it's a religious base of operation for activism, social activism will always be with us. That's why the system, the structure is there to protect all of us. The truth about the law is to guard our liberties, our happiness, our pursuit of happiness is to guard our security, is to provide all of us equal expectation when we plead a case or we have a cause, and that we can all be assured. It also protects us. Security, again, is a big word right now. There's a lot of people experiencing terrible loss of security. And you think about all that's taken place in our civil unrest, had all that been harnessed, and all that energy, rather than being expressed in a destructive manner, it had been in a constructive manner. Signatures secured months ago, polling locations identified, secured, the integrity of mail and ballots, and receiving a ballot in the mail or sending. See, if focus had been on how will we have an election under a COVID-19 global pandemic, that could have started as late as February, or as early as February and as late as March. And then you would be seeing a nation prepared to make a statement that would have would reflect a full participation. Now it's fractured. People have disqualified themselves. Some cities are in such disarray they could never possibly put it back together to even have some semblance of order. So many people have now been arrested, adjudicated, warrants served, federal charges filed. They may not be legally allowed to even show their face, much more than present identification and out themselves. So it's very disappointing that had the energy been harnessed and the discipline been there, people could really be looking forward to an outcome in this election that would reflect a process that had been assured, secured, and it would have given us more constructive things, because from a person's view like myself, who wants best for people and wants to see people, young people specifically, to hear about people with college degrees now have ruined their lives, they've had federal charges, hear people that had that kind of education, that kind of skill set, that kind of brilliance, that they could have applied it to utilize the system, have gone out and futilized it. And futility is hard to prevail. It's hard to prevail futility, and it's hard to prevail in a system that's constantly broken down, because now those, for example, who remained on course, who didn't go out and negate themselves, disqualify themselves, they're more prepared to go and assure that their voice is heard, that the system is secured, just like this nomination. It's being carefully and deliberately promoted, as people would say, pushed through, because it's a moment that their attention has been focused on since the last nomination 2 years ago. So rather than begrudge, I would recommend people learn from that, because this candidate was selected 2 years ago and has been queued and ready, so that at the moment the opportunity arose, they seized it. Now, others who are complaining about it, that's somewhat of a incidental reality. It's like people complaining. I've had people complain before, even like myself, as someone who has acquired an aptitude to teach, a level of expertise in Bible knowledge, subject matter expertise, specialized knowledge, and I would ask, how is my studying the Bible upsetting you who don't bother? Well, they now know why. Because they disengaged themselves. They didn't remain on track and discipline through design, strength through structure. So those of you that are working on language, you're increasing your education, your knowledge, your IQ's developing, you're learning language, you're learning critical thinking skills. So I'm not sure what part of studying the Bible, what part of being among, let's say, as I identify myself, those who are not Protestant, Catholic, and certainly not Islamic or Judaic, and not occultic or New Age or denomination 1, 2, whatever. I like identifying with the people that walked on the Trail of Tears, by the way. Only the Baptists did that. You can read about Evan Jones. Only the Baptists were involved in the wall of separation. Only the Baptists were involved in the disestablishment of religion. And if there were others, great. But I'm only speaking of what I am more than aware of and can go into history books and cite it. So this is late as 2012. So in my family, there's a trail of tears, and in my faith, there's a trail of blood. And I respect the faithfulness of keeping the hand to the plow. So if there's a word here for those of you who are studying, continue to study, because when you begin to acquire a working knowledge of it and it becomes something you can apply and you review and revise, you deliberately practice, you'll just become better and better at everything you do. You can't have a diminished return on the investment of learning to be disciplined, learning your alphabet, practicing it, learning the strong verbs, learning how to use tools now with computers. So this is just to point out that textualism is a problem in either direction you go. And if this candidate were being selected to be part of a, let's say, a body of cardinals in the Catholic order, she might be a problem for some of them, because someone with that kind of expertise, if the expectation were we're all going to get back and line up with the text, that would be a problem, because that gap is a gulf and it's large. And like I said, independent expressions of Catholicism are probably numerous, and I would not be aware of them. Just as pluralism, as I would say, there's pluralism within the Catholic order. There's pluralism within the Protestant order. There's pluralism among Judaism, among Islam. There's pluralism everywhere. And now there's so many kinds of Baptists. I don't know who would know, but maybe there's a list somewhere. So you have a blessed day. Enjoy this lesson.